With a population of over 200 million people and evidence of life on its territory potentially dating back over 30,000 years, Brazil is a nation with a long and robust history. While its border touches nearly every other South American country, besides being the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, Brazil stands out from its neighbors in a very relevant way. It was colonized by Portugal, not Spain. But how did this happen? How did Portugal shape Brazil? And how did the latter become the country that it is today? The first Portuguese explorer to reach Brazil did so in either the final years of the 15th century or in the 1500s exactly. According to Duarte Pacheco Pereira's book Esmeralda de Cito Orbis, he had found Brazil back in 1498 while on an expedition for King Manuel of Portugal. But this is not the generally accepted timeline. Instead, it's usually asserted that the first Portuguese expedition to reach Brazil came in 1500 with a fleet commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral. He was actually on his way to India, but had been blown immensely off course and eventually spotted land. This led the fleet to make landfall at Porto Seguro, or Safe Harbor, and started the timeline of Portuguese colonization. Once it was realized that this newfound land was on the Portuguese side of the Tordesillas line, the initial goal was to establish a settlement with the focus of monopolizing trade, particularly of the widely popular pau-brasil redwood trees. This, of course, brought the Portuguese into direct interaction with the vast indigenous population in the area. At first, it's believed that the Portuguese settlers and the natives may have worked in harmony to harvest and trade the pau-brasil, but this was predictably short-lived as the situation evolved. As the redwoods were increasingly cut down and used for trade, more and more of Brazil's coast was being flattened, and there became a need to push farther and farther inland to find the trees. As one consequence of this, many of the colonists began to consider alternative forms of resource production for trade, such as the establishment of plantations. Thus ended the collaboration between the Portuguese and the natives, as the former decided that the best way to work their plantations was by enslaving the latter. The result of this was the death and fleeing of dozens upon dozens of indigenous who either hoped to escape slavery, had fallen ill to newly introduced European diseases, or would later die in slavery due to the extreme labor conditions. Those who did flee were not guaranteed safety either, as Jesuit missionaries and Portuguese bandeirantes would push inland, exposing the escaped natives to disease nonetheless, and at the hands of the bandeirantes, enslaving even more. By the mid-1530s, Brazil had been divided up into over a dozen individual colonies to be owned and governed by the affluent Portuguese nobles, though all but one of these settlements would eventually be returned to the Portuguese crown in 1543, as they had failed to truly succeed. A new governor-general was subsequently sent to manage the territory, and a capital was established in Salvador. The Portuguese were not the only European power that wanted in on the action in Brazil, however. Aside from the occasional border dispute with Spain, Portugal didn't have to worry much about their Iberian neighbor thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas from the century prior. It was this agreement that clearly placed Brazil into Portugal's realm of expansion, not Spain's, although outside of Iberia and the Pope himself, who had passed the papal decree solidifying the treaty, no one really accepted these boundaries. As a result, France, England, and other colonial powers were eager to reach Brazil themselves and take what lands they could. The French in particular tried to wedge themselves onto the map, but were consequently beaten back by the Portuguese in the latter half of the 16th century. The Dutch as well would take a shot at seizing part of Brazil, but they too would eventually give in to the possessive Portuguese. And while the Portuguese did manage to hold strong against their outside rivals, within Brazil, some issues began to arise that required fast solutions. Facing a growing need for slaves and a declining local population, Portugal looked to Africa to boost its Brazilian colony. The indigenous population in Brazil had been greatly reduced, but at the same time, the settlers in Brazil had an increasing need for workers at their plantations and elsewhere. It was at this time that the Portuguese looked to Africa. Having already kick-started the Atlantic slave trade the century prior, they now looked to bring workforce from Africa over to Brazil instead of Europe. Doing so would open the transatlantic slave trade, which would go on to have its own dark history over the centuries. But for now, it served as Portugal's solution to the dying-off native population. And the Portuguese didn't do this in small numbers either. In fact, roughly 40% of African slaves involved in the transatlantic slave trade would end up in Brazil, over 8 times the amount that ended up in the United States. Nevertheless, despite the grotesqueness of their method of choice, the Portuguese in Brazil managed to find great success in trade and developing the colony altogether. New minerals and resources were found in Brazil that could be exported at high rates, while additional trade markets would also be opened up as the Portuguese had more to give. By now, Brazil was beginning to resemble its modern form, as its culture diversified and the capital was moved to Rio de Janeiro. This preceded another period of considerable change and movement toward contemporary Brazil, now in the early 19th century, when Napoleon decided to shake things up back in Europe, and also in South and Central America. The Portuguese royal family would be forced to flee their homeland and opted to stay in Brazil while they were away. Upon their arrival, there sprouted a newfound motivation to put more effort into Brazil's local economy and development than had been done prior. This helped to shift Brazil from just a tool of Portugal to its own functioning entity and ultimately primed it for independence. Schools, banks, and other important structures were built, more ports were opened, and Brazil began to flourish. It was at this time that the royals could finally return home to Portugal. But Pedro I, the son of Dom João VI, was left behind to govern Brazil on behalf of Portugal, although he had other ideas. Once left to his own devices, Pedro decided that Brazil deserved more than Portugal could give, and was worth more than it had ever been given credit for, so he declared its independence. Previously, in 1815, Dom João had declared Brazil to be its own kingdom, although it would remain under the watchful eye and heavy hand of Portugal until September 7, 1822. Independence or death, Pedro is said to have shouted from the banks of the Ipiranga River upon announcing the newfound sovereignty of his adopted nation. He was soon crowned as Emperor of Brazil, just in time for a building threat from the Portuguese, a threat that would lead both sides into a bloody war. The Brazilian army and their local militia allies would clash with the Portuguese forces until the end of 1823 as they grappled for control over the former colonies. Fought by land and sea, the war would ultimately end in Brazil's favor when the final Portuguese garrison backed down, leaving the newly independent state in shame. The following period for Brazil was far from easy nonetheless, and internal struggles would eventually lead Pedro to abdicate his throne to his 5-year-old son, Pedro II, and subsequently handed the empire over to a line of regents who would rule in the young boy's place until 1840. Clashes with Brazil's South American neighbors would furthermore test the sovereignty of the young nation. But nothing seemed to dampen the spirits of Brazilian trade, nor immigration into the country. Nevertheless, Brazil's time as an empire would shortly come to a close in 1889, a year after slavery was abolished by the monarchy. In its place was founded the Brazilian Republic, known now as the Old Republic. By 1930, after a string of generally mild presidents, Getúlio Vargas would seize power with a military coup and ruled as a dictator until 1945. The following decades were scarcely less turbulent, however, although efforts were being made by elected presidents to stimulate Brazil's economy and development. Through the 1960s, Brazil would fall under the control of the military, which would command the nation with its harsh methods until 1985, with inflation soaring. The economy was struggling, to say the least, even as Brazilians adopted a new constitution in 1988, and inflation would remain a dreadful obstacle until the 1990s. From that point on, though still entrenched in deep economic and political struggles, Brazil showed resilience nevertheless. And through it all, it had shown the ability to become and remain independent. Had Portugal never colonized its land, it's hard to know what Brazil would be like today. But thanks to the Portuguese colonization that did happen, wherever it stands morally, Brazil was able to become a notable colony and later kingdom of its own. And thanks to the help of the exiled monarchs from Portugal, the colony turned kingdom would soon become a sovereign empire turned republic. Natural resources and reliable trade additionally helped Brazil to put itself on the map, and today it stands as not only an independent country in South America, but as a unique nation among its neighbors, as the only product of the Portuguese side of the Tordesillas line.